"Are you lost, Grandpa?" The question was a shard of glass in the clean, crisp air of the parade ground. It was meant to cut, and it did. The voice belonged to a young lieutenant, a man whose uniform was so new it seemed to hum with the energy of the factory that pressed it. His posture was a perfect, rigid line, a testament to the institution that had molded him, yet his eyes held the flat, incurious certainty of youth. The old man he addressed did not flinch. He stood alone near the base of the Thayer Monument, a silent granite sentinel overlooking the plain at West Point. His name was Elias Thorne, and he was not lost. He was, in a way he could never explain to the boy in the starched uniform, more at home here than anyone else present. His clothes were simple civilian fare, a worn tweed jacket against the autumn chill, soft gray trousers, and comfortable shoes that had seen many miles. He looked like a misplaced academic, or perhaps a local who had wandered onto the grounds by mistake. He turned his head slowly, the motion deliberate, not with the creaking slowness of age, but with the profound patience of a river changing its course. His eyes, pale blue and webbed with the fine lines of 8 decades, held a stillness that the young officer found immediately infuriating. They were like ancient stones at the bottom of a clear stream, unbothered by the frantic currents on the surface. "No, son," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that the wind almost stole. "I know exactly where I am." Lieutenant Kalen Vance felt a hot flush of irritation climb his neck. He had a job to do. This entire quadrant was a restricted zone, a sterile bubble for the arrival of the keynote speaker, a 4-star general. Vance's platoon was responsible for security, and his commander had been brutally clear. No mistakes, no unscheduled variables. This old man was a variable. Vance took a half-step closer, puffing his chest out slightly, an unconscious display of physical authority. He was tall and athletic, a product of modern nutrition and discipline training. The old man, by contrast, seemed fragile, his shoulders stooped, his hands knotted with arthritis. It was a mismatch, a contest between a battering ram and a willow branch. "This is a restricted area, sir," Vance said, forcing the last word through his teeth. Protocol demanded the honorific, but his tone stripped it of all respect. "I need you to move back behind the barriers with the other guests." Elias's gaze drifted past the lieutenant, toward the rows upon rows of cadets standing in perfect formation on the green expanse. Their white trousers were immaculate, their black jackets severe. In the distance, the Hudson River was a ribbon of molten silver under the afternoon sun. He remembered a day, long ago, when he had stood on that same field, his own heart a frantic drum of pride and terror. He thought of his grandson, Daniel, somewhere in that sea of gray and white. Daniel, who was graduating today. Daniel, who had no real idea who his grandfather truly was. To him, Elias was just the quiet old man who smelled of sawdust and old books, who could fix anything but rarely spoke of the past. "I'm just watching," Elias said, his voice still quiet, offering a simple truth. He made no move to leave. He was rooted to this spot, beside this particular monument, for a reason that was his own. This non-reaction was worse than any argument. It was a quiet, passive defiance that Vance's rigid worldview could not process. Respect for authority was binary. You either had it or you did not. This man, with his calm refusal, was breaking the system. Vance interpreted the old man's stillness not as stoicism, but as senility or, worse, deliberate insolence. "Are you deaf?" Vance snapped, his voice now sharp and loud enough to turn a few heads. "I gave you a lawful order. Move it." Now he pointed a finger, jabbing it toward the distant spectator stands. "The seating for the public is over there. Go find your family." A nearby sergeant, a man named Marcus Cole, heard the lieutenant's raised voice and turned. Cole was a decade older than Vance, his face weathered by 2 tours in places that had long since faded from the headlines. He saw the scene, the ramrod-straight lieutenant and the unmoving old man. His instincts, honed by years of reading subtle tensions in hostile environments, pricked up. Something was wrong. The lieutenant was too loud, too aggressive. The old man was too calm. Elias finally turned his full attention back to Vance. He looked at the young man's polished insignia, the sharp creases in his trousers, the unearned confidence in his eyes. He saw not an enemy, but a child, one who had learned all the rules but none of the music. "There's no need to shout, Lieutenant," Elias said, his tone gentle, almost paternal. "I can hear you just fine." The condescension, however mild, was gasoline on the fire of Vance's frustration. This was his zone, his responsibility. He would not be made a fool of by some geriatric wanderer. He stepped directly in front of Elias, blocking his view of the parade ground, a physical wall of uniformed authority. "I don't have time for games, old-timer," Vance spat, the words low and menacing. "You have 60 seconds to be behind that barrier, or I'm going to have you escorted off the grounds. Do you understand me?" Elias sighed, a soft exhalation of breath. It was not a sigh of weariness, but of a profound, ancient disappointment. He had hoped for a quiet day. He had hoped to simply stand in the shadows and watch his grandson step into his own future, a future Elias had fought to secure in ways the world had long forgotten. But the world, it seemed, had a short memory and a loud voice. He pushed up the sleeve of his tweed jacket, a simple, absent-minded gesture to check his old wristwatch. The movement was slow, and as the worn fabric slid back, it exposed the skin of his forearm. There, etched in faded blue-green ink that had blurred with the stretching of old skin, was a tattoo. It was not a skull, or an anchor, or a woman's name. It was a complex, intricate pattern of lines, gears, and interlocking circles, with a jagged lightning bolt at its center. It looked like a page torn from a mad engineer's notebook, a schematic for a machine that defied conventional logic. Vance's eyes, which had been locked on Elias's face, dropped to the exposed arm. His lip curled in a sneer of derision. The old man's quiet dignity had been a puzzle, but this was something he understood. A tattoo, a crude mark from a misspent youth. "What is that supposed to be?" Vance scoffed, a cruel smirk twisting his features. He reached out and, with a startling lack of respect, prodded the tattoo with his fingertip. The touch was light, mocking. "Some kind of prison ink? Get that in the brig after a drunken shore leave." The touch, though gentle, was a physical blow. It was a jolt of lightning that bridged the 60 years separating that moment from another. For a fraction of a second, the crisp autumn air of West Point vanished, replaced by the thick, metallic stench of blood and cordite. The sounds of a brass band were swallowed by the deafening crump of incoming mortar fire and the high, frantic whine of stressed machinery. He was no longer an old man in a tweed jacket. He was a 20-year-old specialist, covered in grease and grime, crouched in the belly of a crippled armored vehicle. The air was thick with smoke, the only light coming from the red glow of failing emergency systems. Outside, the world was a symphony of destruction. Firebase Kilo 7 was being overrun. They were the last stand. A small company of engineers and support staff, cut off and surrounded. Their main generators were gone, their communications were dead, and the perimeter was collapsing. Their only hope was a series of experimental magnetic defenses, powerful coils that could shred incoming projectiles, but the central power conduit had been severed. They were dead in the water. A young Elias Thorne, his face smudged with soot and fear, had stared at the wreckage of 3 different systems. He saw not junk, but a solution. A power inverter from a comms truck, a capacitor bank from a destroyed radar array, a series of relays from a field kitchen's generator. In his mind, a new schematic began to form, a desperate, impossible hybrid of parts that were never meant to work together. There was no paper, no time. His sergeant, a man whose face was a mask of bloody determination, had yelled, "Can you do it, Thorne? Can you make it work?" Elias had grabbed a sharpened piece of rebar and a pot of insulating grease. On the only clean surface he could find, a discarded metal panel, he began to frantically sketch the circuit. Lines, gears, circles, and a jagged lightning bolt to represent the massive, uncontrolled power transfer he was about to attempt. It was a prayer rendered in mechanical engineering. It was the design that now lived on his arm. The memory lasted only a second, but when Elias returned to the present, something in his ancient blue eyes had changed. The placid stream was gone. In its place was something harder, something forged in fire and pressure. It was the look of a man who had held the lives of 100 others in his hands and had not faltered. Vance, oblivious, saw only the old man's momentary disorientation. He took it as a sign of weakness, of final capitulation. He chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Lost in your memories, Pops? I'll bet they're good ones. Now, are you going to move? Or do I have to call the MPs? Sergeant Cole watched from 50 feet away, his stomach twisting into a knot. He had seen the lieutenant touch the old man. He had seen the flicker in the old man's eyes. This was escalating beyond a simple security issue. This was becoming a profound act of disrespect, and Cole's entire being, everything the NCO Corps had instilled in him, rebelled against it. He made a decision. Discretion was key. He turned his back on the confrontation, pulling his phone from his pocket as he pretended to survey the crowd. He did not call the local MPs. That would only bring more junior personnel who would follow the lieutenant's lead. He needed to go higher. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he rarely used, a direct line to the aide of the visiting general. The aide, a brisk and efficient major, answered on the second ring. Major Evans. Sir, Sergeant Cole here, Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. Apologies for the direct call. I'm on the security detail for General Graves' arrival. We have a situation at the Thayer Monument. What kind of situation, Sergeant? The major asked, his tone laced with impatience. The general was 5 minutes out. Lieutenant Vance is in a confrontation with a civilian, an elderly gentleman. Sir, the lieutenant is out of line. Cole chose his words carefully. He's being unprofessional. Unprofessional how? He's threatening to have the man removed, sir. Verbally abusing him. But there's something about this man. He's calm. Too calm. And there's this tattoo on his arm. It's a strange one. Looks like a schematic with a lightning bolt. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Cole could hear muffled voices. The major was clearly relaying the information. Then, a new voice came on the line. A voice that was deeper, calmer, and radiated an authority that made the hairs on Cole's arms stand up. It was General Alistair Graves. Sergeant, this is General Graves. Describe the man to me. Cole's heart hammered in his chest. Sir, he's about 80. Tall but stooped. White hair. Pale blue eyes. Wearing a tweed jacket. He's very quiet, sir. Very still. Another pause, shorter this time. And the tattoo, Sergeant. Describe it again. It's on his left forearm, sir. It's old ink. Looks like a circuit diagram. Gears, wires, and a big lightning bolt in the middle. Sir, Lieutenant Vance he's mocking it. The silence that followed was terrifying. It was not an empty silence. It was heavy, dense with unspoken emotion. When General Graves spoke again, his voice was transformed. The calm authority was gone, replaced by a tone of absolute, cold steel urgency that Cole had only ever heard in combat-critical radio transmissions. Sergeant Cole, listen to me very carefully. You are to keep that man right where he is. Do not let him leave. Do not let your lieutenant lay another hand on him. My ETA is 2 minutes. Acknowledge. Acknowledged, sir. Cole snapped, his training taking over. Good. And Sergeant? You did the right thing. The line went dead. Cole pocketed his phone, his mind reeling. Who was this old man? Who could cause a 4-star general to completely alter his arrival protocol and speak with that kind of earth-shaking urgency? He turned back toward the scene, his walk now infused with a new purpose. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Vance's patience had finally evaporated. The old man's silence was a judgment, a quiet condemnation that he could no longer tolerate. He was done with warnings. He was done with words. That's it, Vance declared, his voice tight with fury. You've had your chance. He reached out and grabbed Elias's upper arm, his grip firm, intending to physically drag the old man away from the monument. You are now a security risk. You're coming with me. It was the final overreach. The ultimate act of arrogant folly. As Vance's fingers closed around the worn tweed of Elias's jacket, a sound sliced through the air, a sound utterly alien to the pomp and circumstance of the ceremony. The high-low wail of a siren, approaching at incredible speed. Heads snapped around. Cadets in the formation broke their rigid focus. A black command car, flags whipping from its fenders, was hurtling down the ceremonial access road, ignoring all protocols. It was followed by 2 more black SUVs, their tires screaming in protest as the small convoy executed a sharp, aggressive turn and slid to a halt on the manicured grass, not 20 feet from the monument. The entire parade ground seemed to hold its breath. The music from the band faltered and died. 1,000 people fell silent. The air crackled with confusion and a dawning sense of awe. Lieutenant Vance froze. His hand was still clamped on Elias's arm. His mind, so ordered and rule-based, could not compute this impossible event. His face was a mask of disbelief, which was slowly being replaced by the pale, cold dread of a man who has just realized he has made a catastrophic, career-ending mistake. The rear door of the command car flew open before it had even fully stopped. General Alistair Graves emerged, not with the stately dignity of a guest of honor, but with the explosive purpose of a soldier entering a firefight. His face was a thundercloud of controlled fury. His eyes, fixed and flinty, swept past the gawking crowd, past the stunned cadets, past Lieutenant Vance, and locked onto the old man in the tweed jacket. The general, a decorated hero of 3 conflicts, a man who commanded legions, strode across the grass with a speed that belied his age. His staff, a collection of colonels and majors, scrambled to keep up. He did not slow down until he was standing directly in front of Elias Thorne. He ignored Vance completely, as if the young officer were nothing more than a piece of scenery. He looked at Elias, and the fury on his face melted away, replaced by an expression of profound, almost reverent respect. Then, in the dead silence of the West Point plain, General Alistair Graves, commander of the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command, snapped his body to the most perfect position of attention he had ever held. His right hand came up in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. "Mr. Thorne," the general's voice boomed, clear and resonant, carrying across the silent field. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." Elias slowly, gently, removed Vance's now limp hand from his arm. He gave the general a small, weary nod. "Alistair, you're making a scene." Vance felt the world tilt on its axis. He stumbled back a step, his mind a howling void. The general had saluted the old man. He had called him sir. The universe no longer made sense. General Graves held his salute for a long moment before dropping it. He turned, not just to Vance, but to the entire assembly, the cadets, the officers, the families, who were now his captive audience. His gaze settled on Vance, and the warmth in his eyes was replaced by a glacial cold. "Lieutenant," the general began, his voice deceptively calm, but with an underlying lethality that made every officer present shudder. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Vance could only shake his head, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Words had abandoned him. "Of course you don't," Graves continued, his voice rising, becoming a tool of public judgment. "You see an old man, an obstacle, a violation of your precious regulations. You see a faded tattoo and you mock it, because you are a child who has read the book of rules, but has never understood the story of why those rules were written in the first place, written in the blood and sacrifice of men like him." The general took a step toward the crowd, his voice now a powerful orator's tool, intended to instruct, to shame, and to honor. "Let me educate you, Lieutenant. Let me educate all of you. This is not just Mr. Thorne. This is Elias Thorne. To the very few who know the real history of our armed forces, he is known by another name, the Ghost of the Forge." A ripple of whispers went through the assembled officers. The name was a legend, a myth from the darkest days of forgotten conflicts. A name spoken in hushed tones at the Command and General Staff College. A name associated with impossible feats of battlefield engineering. They had thought it was just a story. 50 years ago, General Graves boomed, his arms sweeping out to indicate the peaceful valley. In a place that was the exact opposite of this beautiful, orderly campus, a place of mud and fire and death called Firebase Kilo 7, a battalion of American soldiers was about to be annihilated. Their perimeter was breached. Their weapons were failing. They were cut off, and they were preparing to die. The general's eyes found Elias again, and his voice softened with respect. But they had a 20-year-old specialist with them, a young man who saw solutions where others saw only scrap. With his firebase collapsing around him, with mortar rounds shaking the very earth he stood on, this specialist, Elias Thorne, scavenged the parts from 3 destroyed vehicles and, in under an hour, jury-rigged a cascading power surge that brought the entire base's defensive grid back online. It was a 1-in-a-million shot, an act of sheer, unadulterated genius under unimaginable pressure. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the stunned crowd. He then walked over to Elias and gently took his forearm, holding it up for all to see. "This tattoo," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his finger tracing the faded lines. "This ink that you, Lieutenant, found so amusing. This is not a drunken memory. This is the schematic. This is the circuit diagram he drew on a piece of battlefield debris from memory. The design that saved 117 American lives." He had it tattooed on his arm a week later, not as a trophy, but as a memorial, a reminder of the cost of innovation and of every single man who went home to their families because of what he did in that bunker. General Graves let go of Elias's arm and turned his full, wrathful attention back to Lieutenant Vance. The young man had visibly shrunk. The starched perfection of his uniform now seemed like a hollow costume. "You stand on this hallowed ground." The general's voice dropped to a near whisper, yet it carried more menace than any shout. "Ground consecrated by the quiet, hidden valor of men like Elias Thorne. You wear a uniform that he honored in ways you cannot possibly comprehend. And you used your brief, insignificant authority to harass him, to humiliate him, to lay your hands on him." He took a final step toward Vance, his shadow falling over the young officer. "You are a disgrace not to the uniform, but to the ideal it represents. You have failed the most fundamental test of an officer, judgment. Report to my aide. Consider your commission suspended. We will discuss the future of your career, if you have one, at a later date. Now get out of my sight." Vance, his face ashen, managed a pathetic, trembling attempt at a salute, then turned and fled, a man utterly and publicly broken. The general watched him go before turning back to Elias. The entire parade ground remained silent, the cadets standing like statues, having just received the most powerful lesson on leadership they would ever get. "I apologize, Elias," Graves said softly. "For him. For all of it." Elias looked at the general, then at the frozen cadets, and finally toward the spot where his grandson Daniel stood, watching with wide, unbelieving eyes. He placed a gentle, gnarled hand on the general's immaculate sleeve. "He is young, Alistair," Elias said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the swirling emotional currents. "The young are often loud because they are afraid of silence. They build walls of rules because they have not yet learned to trust their own foundations. He needs a teacher, not a hammer." General Graves looked at the old man, at the profound grace he was offering in the face of such disrespect. He nodded slowly. "A teacher he will get, then. The hardest one I can find," he paused. "Your grandson graduates today? You must be very proud." "I am," Elias said simply. "He's a good boy. He will be a good officer." He looked at the general. "Better than I was. Less angry." The incident at the Thayer Monument became the stuff of West Point legend overnight. It was never officially documented, but every cadet from that day forward knew the story of the ghost of the forge. Lieutenant Vance was not discharged. Instead, acting on Elias's wisdom, General Graves had him reassigned. Vance spent the next year at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His sole duty was to archive the unclassified records of forgotten engineering and logistics units from past conflicts, and to write a formal paper on the role of battlefield innovation. He was being taught the history he had so arrogantly ignored. A new, informal mandate was added to officer training at the academy. It was a single-day seminar on humility and heritage, focused on recognizing the unassuming veterans who walked among the civilian population. It had no official name, but among the cadets and faculty, it was known only as the Thorne Protocol. 6 months passed. Winter had given way to a tentative spring. Kalen Vance, thinner now, and with a quietness in his eyes that had not been there before, was in the West Point Library archives on a research trip. He moved through the silent stacks of books and records with a new reverence. He was learning. He was beginning to understand. He turned a corner and stopped. There, at a small wooden table, bathed in the soft light from a tall window, sat Elias Thorne. He was reading a thick, leather-bound book on civil engineering. He looked up as Vance's shadow fell across his page. Vance stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, but all the words he had prepared now felt cheap and inadequate. He simply walked to the small coffee station at the end of the room, purchased a cup of black coffee, and returned to the table. He placed the cup gently on the wood beside Elias's book. He did not speak. He could not. Elias looked from the coffee cup to the young man's face. He saw the shame, the regret, but underneath it, he saw something new, the first shoots of humility. The foundation was being laid. Vance finally found his voice, a raw whisper. "Thank you, sir." It was all he could manage. It was everything he needed to say. Elias Thorne looked at the humbled officer, the boy who had tried to be a man by shouting, and who was now learning to be one by listening. He gave a single, slow nod of acceptance. A silent understanding passed between them. The lesson was learned. The debt was paid. And the story of the past, for a moment, had found its proper place in the present.